The coffee at Stella's cafe was absolutely terrible, and that was precisely why Emperor Thane kept coming back every single morning. In the Galactic Imperium, no one would dare serve him bad coffee. Not a single soul would seat him at a wobbly table in a dimly lit corner where the light flickered every few minutes. No one would forget his order or accidentally bring him the wrong pastry, still cold from the freezer. But here, tucked away in this cramped human establishment on New Terra Station, surrounded by the smell of burnt beans and recycled air, he was just another customer trying to make it through the station's artificial morning cycle. Thane had ruled 40,000 star systems for 300 years. He commanded fleets powerful enough to shatter moons into dust and armies that numbered in the billions. His word was absolute law across half the known galaxy. Entire civilizations rose and fell based on his decisions. Wars ended because he willed it. Peace treaties were signed in his name. And yet, here he sat, disguised as nothing more than a common trade administrator, in this unremarkable cafe, pretending for just a few precious hours that none of it existed. The weight of the crown was invisible, but Thane felt it every moment of every day. 3 centuries of decisions. 3 centuries of political games. 3 centuries of beings who smiled to his face while plotting behind his back. 3 centuries of never knowing if someone spoke to him because they valued him or because they feared him. But in Stella's cafe he was nobody. Just another alien trying to stomach the worst coffee in the sector. "Excuse me, is anyone sitting here?" The voice cut through his thoughts. It was soft, distinctly human, with that peculiar musical quality their species used when asking polite questions. Thane glanced up from his data tablet to see a young human woman standing beside his table. She wore dark glasses despite the cafe's already dim lighting, and her hand rested lightly on a white mobility cane that gleamed under the flickering lights. "No," he replied, his translator converting his natural clicking speech into smooth English. "Please sit." She smiled, and it was genuine. Not the calculated smile of courtiers or the nervous smile of those who feared his kind. Just a simple, warm smile. She carefully folded her cane with practiced movements before sliding into the seat across from him. Her movements were economical, efficient, like she had done this 1,000 times before. She reached out, fingers gently brushing across the table's surface until they found the menu reader. She picked it up and held it close to her ear, listening to the device describe the day's offerings in a quiet voice only she could hear. "You're new here," she said after a moment, not looking in his direction. Or rather, Thane realized with a start, not looking at all. Her eyes, hidden behind those dark glasses, didn't track movement the way sighted beings did. "I haven't heard your voice before. The regular morning crowd is pretty small, and I know most of them by sound." "I've been coming here for 2 weeks," Thane replied cautiously. In his experience, humans were either terrified of his species or trying to exploit them for political gain. The Kryn were not known for being approachable. Their chitinous frames, multiple sensory stalks that moved independently, and natural predatory aspects made most species deeply uncomfortable. Children of other races often cried at the sight of adult Kryn warriors. "Ha, interesting. I work the afternoon shifts, so we must have just missed each other every day." She set down the menu reader with a small laugh. "The timing is kind of funny when you think about it. 2 weeks of ships passing in the night or morning, I guess." She extended her hand across the table. "I'm Kate, by the way. Kate Morrison. You may call me Thane." He'd made the decision to keep his actual name, simply stripping away the 17 ceremonial titles and honorifics that usually preceded it. Emperor. Eternal Ruler. Master of the Void Throne. Supreme Commander. All of it meaningless here. Kate's handshake was firm, confident. Not the hesitant touch most beings offered when meeting a Kryn for the first time. "Nice to meet you, Thane. Let me guess based on the breathing pattern." She tilted her head, listening to the distinctive clicking sound his respiratory system made. "You're Kryn, right? We studied your species last semester in my xenolinguistics course." The professor played recordings of Kryn speech patterns. Very distinctive. Musical almost if you listen past the clicks. Most species identified his people by sight. The towering frames that could reach nearly 8 feet tall. The armored exoskeletons that could deflect most small arms fire. The sensory stalks that could detect the slightest movement across vast distances. But this human woman, sitting in a dimly lit cafe with terrible coffee and flickering lights, had identified him by sound alone. By the rhythm of his breathing. It was, Thane realized, the most remarkable thing that had happened to him in years. 3 weeks became a routine that Emperor Thane guarded more fiercely than any state secret he'd ever kept. Every single morning at 0900 station time, He would arrive at Stella's cafe wearing his plain administrator's clothing. Nothing fancy. Nothing that would draw attention. Just simple, worn fabric that had seen better days. He would order the same terrible coffee that somehow tasted worse each day, and a pastry that had the texture and flavor of recycled cardboard. And then, like clockwork, at exactly 0915, Beth Morrison would slide into the seat across from him, fold her white cane with those practiced movements, and treat him like he was the most ordinary being in the entire galaxy. It was absolutely intoxicating. For someone who spent 3 centuries being treated like a living god, being ordinary was the most extraordinary gift anyone had ever given him. No bowing. No formal titles. No one watching their every word in case they accidentally offended the supreme ruler of half the known galaxy. Just conversation. Just friendship. Just 2 people sharing terrible coffee and worse pastries. You know, Beth said one morning, stirring her coffee absently with a small spoon, I've started calling you Click in my head. Because of your breathing pattern. The way it clicks in rhythms. Hope that's not offensive or anything. Thane's sensory stalks twitched with genuine amusement. The Emperor of the Kryn Imperium. Master of the Void Throne. Supreme Commander of the Eternal Fleets. Conqueror of the 7th Nebula. The being whose name was spoken with reverence and fear across 40,000 star systems. All of it reduced to a simple onomatopoeia. Click. Like a child's nickname for a pet. I find it endearing actually, he admitted, and he meant it. When was the last time anyone had given him a nickname? When was the last time anyone had felt comfortable enough around him to be so casual? Good, because I already told my roommate about my Kryn friend Click, who has absolutely terrible taste in cafes. Beth grinned, her smile lighting up her whole face. She thinks I'm completely making you up. Like you're my imaginary friend or something. Why would she think that? Thane asked, genuinely curious. Because apparently I have this habit of befriending stray cats and lost causes, Beth explained with a laugh. And a lonely alien who voluntarily drinks Stella's coffee every single day definitely qualifies as both. She paused, her head tilting slightly as she listened to his breathing. You are lonely, aren't you? I can hear it in your voice sometimes. Like you're carrying something really heavy. Something that weighs you down. Thane was silent for a long moment. Around them, the cafe bustled with the usual morning traffic. Humans rushing to their jobs, clutching travel mugs and checking their data pads. A few Valorians in the corner, their blue skin shimmering under the lights, discussing trade routes. Even a Corthan diplomat near the window, arguing loudly into a comm device about tariffs and taxation. His security team, he knew without looking, was scattered throughout the crowd. Some posed as customers. Others as staff. All of them watching everything, ready to act if any threat emerged. But here, at this wobbly table that rocked every time someone leaned on it, he felt strangely alone with Beth in a way he'd never experienced before. Like they existed in a bubble separate from the rest of the universe. Just the 2 of them and terrible coffee. The weight of duty, he said finally, choosing his words carefully. Responsibilities that cannot be shared or set down. Burdens that must be carried alone. Yeah, I get that, Beth said softly. Her fingers traced the rim of her coffee mug, feeling the small chip on one side that the cafe had never bothered to replace. Different scale, obviously. I mean, I'm not running anything important. But I get it. Everyone expects me to be either completely helpless or some kind of inspiration. Like I'm supposed to be brave and cheerful all the time just because I'm blind. Just once, I'd like to be ordinary, you know? To just exist without being someone's lesson or someone's burden or someone's feel-good story of the day. You are neither to me, Thane said quietly, and he realized how true it was. You are simply Beth. My friend who drinks terrible coffee and studies alien languages and has strong opinions about cafe quality. Beth's smile was radiant, genuine, reaching her eyes even behind those dark glasses. I know. That's exactly why I keep showing up for this terrible coffee every morning. You treat me like a person, not like a disability with legs. Their conversations over those 3 weeks ranged across topics that Thane hadn't considered in decades. Beth asked about Kryn culture, but not the boring political structure that his advisors constantly droned about in council meetings. She wanted to know the small things. The real things. What kind of music did his people enjoy? What did Kryn consider beautiful? Did they have art? Poetry? Did they laugh? Did they have a concept equivalent to human humor? And Thane found himself answering with stories from before his coronation. Before the weight of the crown had turned every moment into a calculation. He told her about the singing crystals in his home province, massive formations that chimed in complex harmonics when the wind blew through them. How young Kryn would gather there during festivals, listening to nature's symphony. He described the bioluminescent forests where the trees glowed in patterns that shifted with the seasons, creating light shows that could make even the most hardened warrior stop and stare in wonder. The assassin struck on a Tuesday morning, right in the middle of the breakfast rush at Stella's cafe. Thane had been in the middle of describing a nebula formation to Beth, talking about the swirling colors and the way stellar dust created patterns like artwork across space. He was carefully editing out the fact that he'd actually ordered an entire fleet to divert their course so he could observe it personally. Just a small detail he'd left out. One of many. That's when his sensory stalks detected the weapon signature. Plasma charges. Military grade. High-end assassination equipment. The kind that didn't exist on civilian stations. The kind designed to punch through armor and shields. And they were targeting him specifically, locked onto his biosignature with deadly precision. He had perhaps 2 seconds to react. Maybe less. In those 2 seconds, Emperor Thane made a choice that would fundamentally alter the course of galactic history. A choice that revealed more about his character than 3 centuries of rule ever had. He didn't dive for cover behind the reinforced counter. He didn't trigger his personal shields in a wide defensive radius that would have protected him perfectly but vaporized everyone nearby in a wave of energy feedback, including Beth. He didn't call for his guards or activate any of the dozen emergency protocols built into his disguised armor. Instead, he lunged across the wobbly table, sending coffee cups and pastries flying. He wrapped his armored limbs around Beth's fragile human body and activated a directional shield that cocooned them both in a protective bubble of energy. Her safety before his own. A human woman he'd known for 3 weeks before his own survival. The cafe exploded into chaos. Plasma fire tore through the building like a hot knife through butter. The windows shattered outward in a spray of glass. The walls, cheaply constructed from standard station materials, disintegrated under the assault. Screams erupted from every direction as patrons scrambled desperately for exits, trampling over chairs and tables. The smell of burning metal and scorched plasteel filled the air, acrid and choking. The assassin, a Corthan mercenary that Thane's combat-trained mind identified automatically, was firing from the upper level. His position gave him a clear tactical advantage and he was using it. Each shot targeted the table where the Emperor sat with systematic precision, walking the fire closer and closer. Professional. Efficient. Deadly. Then Thane's security team arrived, and all pretense of normalcy shattered. Commander Vax materialized from the panicked crowd like a ghost becoming solid. He'd been posing as a maintenance worker in the corner, but now he stood in full view, no longer bothering with any concealment. His Imperial combat armor gleamed under the emergency lights, polished to a mirror shine and inscribed with the royal seal. He returned fire with weapons that were decidedly not standard issue for New Terra Station. Weapons that shouldn't exist outside of military warships. Weapons that screamed Imperial authority with every shot. Within seconds, a full squad of the Emperor's elite guard had materialized from their hiding spots and secured the perimeter. They moved with practiced precision, their presence absolutely unmistakable. These weren't station security. These weren't local law enforcement. These were the personal guards of the Galactic Emperor himself, and everyone in the cafe knew it. The firefight lasted exactly 90 seconds. Thane counted each one. When it ended, the assassin was dead, slumped over the upper railing with smoke rising from his chest. Half the cafe was completely destroyed, reduced to rubble and debris. Tables were overturned. The counter was riddled with plasma burns. The smell of destruction hung heavy in the air. Annabeth Morrison was trembling in Thane's arms, her face pressed against his chitinous chest plate, her breathing rapid and panicked. "What?" she started, her voice shaking badly. "Thane, what's happening? What was that? Those weapons, that armor?" Her voice rose with each word, panic bleeding through. "That's Imperial Guard tech. I've heard the signature in my military history courses. The plasma resonance is distinctive. Why would the Emperor's personal guard be here? Why would they be protecting?" She stopped mid-sentence. Her fingers, still resting against his chest from where she'd grabbed him during the explosion, felt something. Intricate patterns etched into his armor. Not random. Not decorative. Deliberate. Meaningful. Patterns she'd studied extensively in her xenoanthropology courses when they covered Kryn royal customs and traditions. Royal designation marks. Sacred symbols of authority. The kind that were laser-etched into the armor of the Imperial family. The kind that only one Kryn in the entire Imperium, across 40,000 star systems, was permitted to bear. The Emperor's marks. "No," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the alarms now blaring throughout the cafe. Her hands moved across the patterns, tracing them with trembling fingers, reading them like Braille. Understanding flooding through her with horrible clarity. No, that's not possible. You can't be. Beth, Thane started, his voice gentle, trying to explain, trying to find words that could somehow make this better. For 2 weeks, Emperor Thane did not return to New Terra Station. For 2 long, agonizing weeks, he sat on the Void Throne and ruled his empire with cold, mechanical precision. He reviewed trade agreements between distant star systems, spending hours reading documents that all blurred together. He mediated territorial disputes between species who'd been fighting for generations, making decisions that affected billions of lives. He commanded fleets across the galaxy, moving warships like pieces on a game board. He signed legislation and executive orders, his signature authorizing everything from infrastructure projects to military campaigns. He performed every single duty expected of him, fulfilling every obligation of his position. And every moment of every day he thought of Beth. Her laugh. The way she tilted her head when listening carefully. How she'd called him Click without a trace of fear or reverence. The trust in her voice when she'd invited him to her apartment for dinner. The warmth of her friendship, freely given, expecting nothing in return. His advisors were absolutely relieved that his phase of rebellion had finally ended. They exchanged satisfied glances during council meetings, pleased that the Emperor had come to his senses. High Chancellor Corvin, in particular, seemed especially pleased that the Emperor had resumed his proper isolation. The court returned to its normal rhythms of political maneuvering and elaborate ceremony, the endless dance of power and influence that had defined the empire for centuries. No one seemed to notice that their emperor had become a hollow shell. That he sat on his throne like a statue, going through the motions but feeling nothing. That the light had gone out of his eyes. Meanwhile, 40,000 light-years away on New Terra Station, Beth Morrison tried desperately to resume her normal life. She returned to work, but at a different cafe since Stella's was still being reconstructed. The new place was cleaner, brighter, and served actually decent coffee. She hated it. She attended her xenolinguistics classes remotely, staring at her audio interface without really hearing the lectures. She met with her study group, going through the motions of discussing alien cultural practices and linguistic patterns. But at night, alone in her small apartment, she sat in her favorite chair and turned over the pieces of the puzzle that had been her friend. The way Thane had spoken about duty and responsibility, like it was a physical weight that could crush stars. Like he carried the universe on his shoulders. The casual mentions of witnessing nebula formations up close, visiting distant provinces across the galaxy, attending diplomatic functions. Things that shouldn't have been possible for a simple trade administrator. The fact that he'd never seemed surprised by anything she told him about galactic politics. He'd never asked for clarification or background. He'd always known exactly what she was talking about. Because of course he had. He'd personally written half those policies himself. And the way he'd protected her during the attack. No hesitation. No calculation. Just immediate action, throwing himself across the table to shield her body with his own. Like her life mattered more than his own. Like losing her would have been worse than dying. Beth wasn't stupid. She'd been angry and hurt when the truth revealed itself. But as the shock slowly faded over days and nights of reflection, she began to understand the impossible position Thane had been in. An emperor couldn't just walk up to someone and reveal himself. The security risks alone were absolutely staggering. Every conversation would need to be monitored. Every interaction would become a potential threat. And if he'd told her the truth in that very first conversation, when she'd asked if anyone was sitting at his table, she would have either not believed him at all or would have treated him completely, fundamentally differently. She wouldn't have called him Click like it was the most natural thing in the world. She wouldn't have complained about her professors to him. She wouldn't have invited him to her tiny apartment for homemade pasta. She wouldn't have been his friend. She would have been his subject. Another person who saw the crown instead of the person wearing it. And Thane had wanted a friend so desperately, so completely, that he'd risked everything for it. His security. His position. Maybe even his empire. Beth was still processing this realization, still trying to figure out what it meant and how she felt about it, when the crisis hit like a meteor strike. It started with news reports interrupting her regular audio feeds. A faction within the Kryn Imperium, led by someone called General Draketh and openly supported by High Chancellor Corvin, had declared the Emperor mentally unfit to rule. They'd filed formal charges with the Imperial Council. Their evidence was damning and public. His unauthorized fraternization with a human civilian, his abandonment of sacred duty for personal pleasure, his weakness in allowing himself to be corrupted by what they called an inferior species. The reports showed images of Thane sitting in Stella's cafe, enhanced and annotated. Videos of him walking through the market with Beth, helping her navigate when her device malfunctioned. The newscasters speculated wildly about the nature of the relationship between the Emperor and the human woman. Some called it scandalous. Others called it unprecedented. All of them treated it like the biggest story in galactic history. And then came the ultimatum that made Beth's blood run cold. Emperor Thane had exactly 48 hours to return to the Imperial homeworld and submit to a formal competency evaluation before the full council. If he refused, if he tried to resist, General Drakketh would assume emergency powers under ancient Imperial law. And to prove humanity's corrupting influence once and for all, to demonstrate what happened when the Emperor was compromised, they would begin with a demonstration of force. Target: New Terra Station. Beth heard the news sitting in her apartment, listening to her regular news stream. She'd been making tea, going through her normal evening routine, when the announcement cut through everything else. 20 Imperial warships were already en route to New Terra Station. Massive dreadnoughts capable of reducing the entire station to atoms. They would arrive in 36 hours. All humans were being advised to evacuate immediately. Transport ships were being mobilized. Emergency protocols were activating across the station. Stella's cafe, or what remained of it, would be the first target destroyed. A symbolic gesture. The place where the Emperor had fallen from grace. "This is insane," Beth whispered to her empty apartment, her hands shaking so badly she nearly dropped her tea. "This is completely insane because of me." Her comm unit chimed urgently, cutting through her spiraling thoughts. It was her roommate, Lisa, calling from off-station where she'd been visiting family on one of the outer colonies. "Beth, you need to get out of there right now." Lisa's voice was panicked, words tumbling over each other. "The evacuation ships are already completely overwhelmed. I'm trying to book you passage on anything, literally anything that's leaving, but—" "Lisa, this is my fault," Beth interrupted, her voice hollow. 3 months after the crisis at New Terra Station, Emperor Thane stood before the Galactic Council and did something no Kryn ruler had done in 5 centuries. Something that shocked every being in attendance. He admitted he'd been wrong. For too long, his voice echoed through the massive chamber, bouncing off walls that had witnessed millennia of imperial declarations. "I have ruled from isolation. I believed that connection was weakness, that emotion was a liability, that an emperor must stand alone above all others, separate and distant. I was mistaken." The assembled representatives from 40,000 star systems listened in absolutely stunned silence. You could have heard a pin drop in that enormous room. Ambassadors who'd been taking notes stopped writing. Delegates who'd been whispering to aides went quiet. Even the protocol droids paused their recordings. In the gallery reserved for special guests, high above the main floor, Beth Morrison sat beside Lisa, listening to the live translation through her audio device. Her hands gripped the armrests of her seat as she heard Thane's words, broadcast across the entire galaxy. "A wise human once told me," Thane continued, his voice carrying the weight of conviction, "that true understanding doesn't require sight but perspective. That we must see beings not for their positions or their utility to us, but for who they fundamentally are as individuals. This philosophy, learned over terrible coffee in a small cafe, will now guide imperial policy going forward." He outlined his reforms in detail, speaking for nearly an hour about changes that would reshape the empire. A new council of perspectives, where representatives from all species including humans, would have direct advisory access to the throne itself. No more going through layers of bureaucracy. No more being dismissed as insignificant. Trade agreements that favored mutual cooperation over exploitation of weaker worlds. Cultural exchange programs that would send scholars and artists between systems. Legal protections for smaller worlds against imperial overreach and corporate manipulation. The conservative factions in the chamber were absolutely horrified. Ancient Kryn nobles who'd held power for generations looked like they'd swallowed something bitter. Military generals shifted uncomfortably in their seats, uncomfortable with this talk of cooperation instead of domination. The progressive factions were cautiously optimistic, exchanging hopeful glances but not daring to celebrate yet. Too many promised reforms had died in committee over the centuries. And humanity, often dismissed as a young and impulsive species barely worth noticing, suddenly found themselves with a real voice at the galactic table. A seat at the big kids' table, as Beth had joked when she'd heard about it. "These changes," Thane concluded, his voice ringing with authority, "come not from weakness but from strength. The strength to admit imperfection. The strength to value genuine connection over cold isolation. The strength to learn from those we might previously have dismissed as beneath our notice. That is not weakness. That is wisdom. The chamber erupted into chaos the moment he finished. Some delegates cheered. Others shouted protests. The session dissolved into heated arguments that would continue for days. After the session finally ended, Thane made his way to the gallery where Beth waited. His security team had learned not to hover quite so obviously anymore. Beth had very firmly told Commander Vax, after the incident at New Terra Station, that she didn't need 20 armed guards following her around just to have coffee with a friend. Vax had reluctantly agreed, though he still kept guards within response distance. Some battles you couldn't win. That was quite a speech, Beth said as Thane approached, her head turning toward the sound of his distinctive breathing. Very inspirational. Very moving. Did your advisors write it for you? I wrote it myself actually, Thane replied with as much dignity as he could muster. Then, more quietly, almost sheepishly, though I may have practiced it on you during our last comm call 3 days ago. I know. I could totally hear you reading from a script. Beth grinned, that same mischievous smile he'd fallen in love with months ago in a terrible cafe. You're an absolutely terrible liar, Thane. Which is why I still can't believe you actually pulled off being a random trade administrator for weeks. That was some serious acting. I was motivated by exceptional coffee, he said dryly, his mandibles clicking in amusement. The coffee was terrible and you know it. Yes, but the company was exceptional. Lisa, who'd been watching this entire exchange with barely concealed amusement and a knowing smile, cleared her throat deliberately. I'm going to check out the Valorian gardens everyone keeps talking about. I heard they have flowers that sing or something weird like that. Beth, I'll meet you back at the hotel in 2 hours. Thanks, Lisa. Don't get lost. Please, I'm the one with working eyes here. And yet I navigate better than you do. When they were alone, or as alone as an emperor could ever be with security teams lurking at discreet distances, Thane and Beth fell into the easy, comfortable rhythm they'd established over months of regular communications. Video calls across the galaxy. Late-night conversations when he should have been sleeping. Messages exchanged between council meetings. How are your studies going? Thane asked as they walked slowly through the council building's galleries, past windows that showed the glittering capital city stretching out below them. Really good actually. I got accepted into the Xenological Institute's Cultural Liaison program. Full scholarship, all expenses paid. Beth's voice carried a note of genuine pride. They were very impressed by my unique perspective on interspecies communication. Can't imagine why that would be. Perhaps because you're genuinely brilliant and your research proposal on non-visual species interaction was groundbreaking? Thane suggested. Or maybe because the Galactic Emperor wrote me a letter of recommendation, Beth countered. I may have mentioned your qualifications to the Dean, Thane admitted carefully. In a completely objective, totally non-influential manner. Thane. I also may have suggested that rejecting you would demonstrate an unfortunate bias against both disabled individuals and human potential in general. You threatened them. I provided alternative perspectives on their admissions criteria, Thane said primly. Very diplomatically. Beth laughed, the sound echoing off the marble walls. You're impossible. I prefer to think of myself as persuasive. They walked in comfortable silence for a while, Beth's cane tapping softly against the polished floors. Thane's sensory stalks mapped the route ahead, occasionally offering quiet warnings about steps or obstacles.